The rise of Islam. The objectives are: 1. Discuss the new importance of the Arabian Peninsula that emerged in the 5th and 6th centuries as a result of the caravan trade. And 2nd, identify and describe the new religion of Islam that arose in the Arabian Peninsula and whose prophet was a man named Muhammad. Now, first, beginning with the geography of the region and the people living in Saudi Arabia, that we call it today at least, are the Arabs, the Semitic-speaking people who lived in the Arabian Peninsula, and hence how these Semitic people derive and gain the name Arabs. The Arabian Peninsula was completely lacking of rivers and lakes. These people were nomads, and they moved constantly to find food and water, which would be completely necessary in an environment where people established civilizations and settled down were near rivers and near lakes, sources of water that could be quite reliable. But of course, this set of circumstances and this geography really structured the Arab nomads into loose tribes, each led by a sheikh chosen by the leading families. And these tribes were independent to some extent, but loosely connected through familial bonds. And this was required, and why you couldn't have a massive civilization arise with this nomadic lifestyle is because such a large group couldn't be sustained in all together. You had to have people moving around constantly to be able to survive and live in this context. And so you can notice here from a satellite image how dry and how unforgiving the environment was actually, even today, and certainly in the long distant past. And how did they survive? They lived as farmers, and some as sheep herders, and taking their animals from oasis to oasis. After the camel was domesticated, Arabs really populated more of the desert areas, expanding the caravan trade and developing new trade routes with these camels. They become a central portion of the Silk Road network and the trade coming from the East in general. Now, these Arabs were polytheistic, and they worshipped their gods in several locations, one of which was Mecca, a very important place, often called Makkah. And there in Makkah was the Kaaba, which is a house of worship, whose cornerstone was a sacred stone called the Black Stone. Some even believed that it was a meteorite or some kind of stone sent down from heaven, from the gods. It was sacred. And inside the Kaaba was a massive room where all the gods of the city that were worshipped were located. And so while Mecca later on becomes an important place for the Arab people and for Islam and Muslims in general, we end up seeing that this structure pre-existed Islam, as it was a central place for the Arab polytheistic worship. Now, Muslims will inevitably worship the supreme God, Allah. And they, of course, ended up believing in other tribal gods prior to the movement of Islam. But here you can see the Kaaba, a sacred item. And people believed in the supreme God, but believed in other gods prior to the rise of Islam. But it was really through political disorder in Mesopotamia and Egypt that made the usual trade routes that had been taken very dangerous, which ended up being a great benefit to the Arabs and the Arab nomadic traders in the region. Particularly Mecca becomes a focal point of trade. It was a much safer trade route than what had existed in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. And so much of the trade begins to filter through Saudi Arabia. And of course, this creates wealth. This creates cultural contact with other groups. So this becomes a very central portion of the shift of Saudi Arabia, of the Arab people. This becomes a major shift in terms of increased trade and cultural contact. Now, really, where this begins is not necessarily the geography or even the economic boom, but through a central figure named Muhammad. Muhammad was born in Mecca to a merchant family and was inevitably orphaned at 5. His father and his family in general were caravan traders, and so he was familiar with the cultural interactions. He inevitably married a rich widow named Khadijah, and he became troubled inevitably through his wealth, of course, and through his interaction with other people, became troubled by the growing gap between the generosity of Meccans and some of the greedy Meccans as well. He couldn't understand the gap that existed between these several groups. And so he began to venture into the hills to meditate, to try to find answers. And he received, according to tradition, from Muslims, he received a revelation from God via the angel Gabriel. And Muhammad believed that Allah, the God, had already revealed himself in the distant past through Moses and through what he claimed, Jesus being a prophet. So he revealed, God had revealed himself through Moses and through Jesus, but Muhammad was chosen as the final source of God's revelation. He was the final source of what God had to say, Allah had to say to humanity and to people. And this becomes the central focus around which this revelation ends up forming this religion. These revelations were eventually, in the long term, written down much later, and this formed the Quran and created Islam, which Islam means peace through submission to the will of Allah. That's really what Islam is about. It's saying we will submit to the will of Allah, as, of course, characterized by what Muhammad said and what the Quran depicted. So Muslims are those who practice Islam. Now, the wealthy feared the upset of the established social and political order, and so, of course, few believed. Few wanted to rebel against the established polytheistic, nomadic social order. And so, rather than rock the boat, they don't want to buy into this. So he and his supporters, Muhammad and his supporters, left Mecca and went to Yathrib, which would later be named Medina. And this journey is known as the Hijra, which marks the calendar as year 1 in the Muslim Islamic calendar, which was actually in the Christian calendar, AD, CE, 622. So this emergence of Islam was 600 years, give or take, after the death of Jesus. And so we can see that it's rife for political and contextual controversy. Now, Muhammad won support from those in Medina. In fact, he became quite popular in Medina. And supporters came from all sorts of places. In particular, a very important location was the Bedouins. Now, the Bedouins were Arab nomads in the desert, fierce warriors, being nomadic, not urban at all. And so he ends up gaining a lot of support, and it becomes quite popular. And what was embedded within all of this was not just submission to Allah, but submission to the Prophet was also required. And it just so happens that Muhammad was the Prophet. And so Muhammad became both a religious and a political leader for all these people. And so the Bedouins, being reliable military force, and being that he gathered enough power and people to himself, he, in 630, returned to Mecca with 10,000 men, and they conquered and converted all of the people to Islam by sword. Now, of course, some say today that Islam does not have a tradition of violent conversion. That's not true. It does. This is not a condemnation of Islam or an entire religion in terms of a historical sense, but we can't rewrite history. He returns through sword and power and conquers and destroys those who don't believe, and all others are converted to Islam. So in memory of this, Muslims are to take a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their life, called the Hajj. And here we see in the depiction Muhammad leading the charge with his followers inside the Kaaba, destroying and breaking apart the idols that existed there. And so we see a toppling of what existed there before. Now, what were the teachings of Muhammad? We see that Islam is a monotheistic religion. It emphasizes salvation and offers hope for an afterlife. But this salvation and this hope can only be achieved through following the 5 pillars of Islam. That is, one must believe, one must pray, one must have good charity, fasting, and pilgrimage. And these were the 5 key or core ideals that had to be followed. Now, these get expanded in the creation of the Sharia, which was created after Muhammad's death, but was based on his teaching, supposedly. And this is a law code created by Muslim scholars whom were writing down what Muhammad had said and taught. And Muslims were forbidden to gamble, to eat pork, to drink alcohol, or to be involved in any sort of dishonest behavior. And this really was the central kind of idea of the Sharia, the proper way in which one should behave, not only here and now for the benefit of an Arab society, but for hopes in the afterlife, hopes for heaven. The objectives were then, 1, discuss the new importance of the Arabian Peninsula that had emerged in the 5th and 6th centuries as a result of the caravan trade, and 2, identify and describe the new religion of Islam that arose in the Arabian Peninsula and whose prophet was a man named Muhammad.